Thank you, everyone. I'm David Korth. I'm your MC, I suppose you could call it, here today. I am not only a member here at Peninsula Temple Shalom, I am one of a handful of folks. I'm going to ask our planning team members to raise your hand. We have about 4 or 5 of us here, and we are all volunteers who help plan our sessions of Let's Talk Mental Health Community Conversation Series. How many of you here experienced either long-term or short-term a mental health experience, mental illness experience?
Yeah, the family.
That may even include something like stress. How many hands go up? Very good. So when we talk about mental illness, mental health issues here in this context, we're talking about the full spectrum. So not necessarily diagnostic, long-term. We're talking about something that every one of us experience. How many of you here know somebody who has a lifelong mental illness diagnosed? And I will say, so it was the vast majority of you. Oh, I forgot. Did I ask how many of you are professionals in the field? Not clergy, but like psychologists, social workers, and the like? Or wannabes, even? Great. I happen to be a social worker. So, how many of you are parents of an adult living with mental illness? It was that last question that really brought a lot of us planners together. A lot of us have, the code word in our community is we have family members, or I'm a family member, and that's code for there's someone in my family, either immediate family or extended family, who's living with a severe mental illness. And so everybody here, obviously you would be here, unless you were just, how many are here just because you're curious and you didn't fit any of the other categories? Nobody. Very good. So yes, mental health, mental illness is something that I think this group is a microcosm of the greater community. But not everybody is willing to talk about it. And part of one of our missions, one of our goals, is really to stamp out the stigma associated with mental illness. I also want to thank members of the National Alliance on Mental Illness, or NAMI. How many of you are here representatives or associated with NAMI? Thank you all for being here. We have board members, we have volunteers, and NAMI has a bunch of really great community resources over on the side there. There will be an opportunity before you leave today to go over there to help yourself to some of those resources. And our guest speaker, Rabbi Weiss, who you'll be meeting in a moment, also brought some resources and can link you as well. Let me share with you some of the topics we've dealt with in the past. We've heard about different therapeutic modalities from local psychologists, behavioral therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, and related services, and how that works, what the theory is behind those. We had a session around suicide prevention, postvention, and prevention. So even after the fact, how support can go to those affected by someone close to you, maybe, who have committed suicide, was a topic. We've had a couple of sessions where, and this was in partnership with NAMI, one of their programs is people living with mental illness came and spoke directly about their experience. One of the more popular sessions that we have. And we also had members of our law enforcement community up and down the peninsula and talked about the interface between law enforcement and those living with mental illness, and how to optimize that experience instead of things going south unnecessarily when law enforcement gets involved. So that's just some examples of the kind of topics we've talked about. I have been waiting for today's topic for a very long time. It was something that I really had hoped we could bring, and I'm really happy so many of you showed up to hear about the interface between spirituality and mental illness. And we have a great expert to speak with us about that, not to build up expectations. With all of that, I am now going to introduce you to Rabbi Dan Feeder, who is a senior rabbi here at Peninsula Temple Shalom, to really get the content of our program going a bit.
Friends, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Let's try that one more time. Good afternoon, friends.
Good afternoon. Shalom.
So this program today really comes out of years of community organizing. We started our community organizing work at Temple Sholem in 2011, and we found out early on that the community organizing effort would best start within our congregation and our congregational framework, and that we could use it as a vehicle for our community to get to know itself and each other much, much better. Gradually, after almost 3 years of using it to get to know one another better, we were ready to adopt what we would call our social justice efforts that would point our actions outside of the doors of Temple Shalom and work in conjunction with the entire community, the civic community, the religious community, schools, county, to effect change on some issue. It rather organically but quickly became clear that the area that we most wanted to endeavor to make a difference in wasn't what we originally thought might be around either hunger or economic injustice or homelessness, but rather mental health. And as that became clear, because I was sensing that's where the energy was, I thought about what percentage of my time as a pulpit rabbi was centered around mental health issues. And it became crystal clear that a very significant amount of time and a very significant percentage of our congregational families had been significantly affected by mental wellness challenges. And with the help of Rabbi Lisa Delson, the associate rabbi here at Temple Shalom, the community that was organizing that effort decided to call that initiative Panim El Panim, which is a phrase that we read in our Torah, in the book of Exodus, and in the book of Deuteronomy in particular, and it means face to face. Although literally it means faces to faces. Either way, whether it's face to face or faces to faces, that's what we wanted to do. To, like David said, try to eliminate the stigma associated with mental illness, and to see if we could, in working on a community level, effect some real changes that would alleviate the sources of the strains on individuals' and families' mental health. We found Rabbi Weiss to be a wonderful source of help. And Rabbi Weiss is someone that I've worked closely with. I was just thinking, going all the way back to the summer of 1990, and one of the most difficult funerals I ever led, which was as a student rabbi, was back in the summer of 1991, and Rabbi Weiss worked closely with me on that. When we wanted to make our congregational community a kinder, more gentle, more emotionally and spiritually aware community, we worked closely over a whole year with Rabbi Weiss and his rabbinic colleagues. And so this is an area that we are very pleased to be a community center on. We're glad to be doing this. We're really glad to have a significant percentage of the people who come to these events, people who aren't members of our congregation, because that's exactly what we're trying to do. So it is our hope that we can be a vehicle for change, all of our efforts together, and that individually you will find your lives uplifted, your perspectives opened, your hearts touched by what you hear and what you see today and in the year to come with our Let's Talk Mental Health program. Thank you for being here. Thank you for partnering with us in our community. David?
I am excited to invite Rabbi Weiss, who I consider a good friend and colleague. Please come on up. Rabbi Weiss is, I'll let him tell you his role. You know what?
They're both
Use that one.
Okay. Hi, everybody.
In terms of our dialogue, I'll use this in the audience so that, sort of like...
Perfect. Okay. So I'm generally soft-spoken. Can you hear me can you hear me? Okay. So I'm so happy to be here. We at the Bay Area Jewish Healing Center, we love Peninsula Temple Shalom. We just love the work we've done with this community over many years. We love Rabbi Theodore and the entire clergy group and the lay leadership, David Korth and others. So just as sort of one rabbi, one kind of other Jew out there in the community, we have such existential pride for this place and for all of you. So I want to talk with you in a more personal, maybe rabbinic, sort of experiential way about a very particular way in which to approach mental illness, which is around issues of the spiritual narrative. And I kind of want to start out kind of big and then hone in like a funnel to get really focused together on this. And a lot of what I want to start with is just kind of truth in advertising about who I am and where I come from, just as an example to say I encourage you to kind of come forward with who you are and how you see things. Starting on a really big picture, I think that in the United States, as a particular American kind of way of being in the world, maybe North American, maybe also Canada, we're marked by something very interesting, which is that we have a separation of church and state, but we have an extraordinary attachment to faith structures in this country. And I really think that part of any religious development into the next century, whether it's Christian, whether it's Buddhist, whether it's Jewish, whether it's Muslim, whether it's spiritualist in general, certainly whether it's just plain old American identity, is really into the next century is going to be marked by the spiritual journey. I'll talk a little bit more about what I think about that, but it's really going to be marked by the spiritual journey. And I think that if you use sociological indices, a core marker of the spiritual journey is caring. That is to say that I really think that people are going to attach themselves to civic enterprises or any faith-based religious enterprise based on the degree to which one gets to care for others and the degree to which people are themselves cared for. That caring is going to mark the manner in which we understand the spiritual journey. And that can have a lot of influence on other things like social action or political action. But that we are going to make decisions into the next century on lots and lots of levels, essentially by the manner in which our spiritual journey can be marked by caring. Caring on all sorts of levels, including how we include one another in our lives, how we care about one another in our lives, the ways in which we feel we are cared for by others in our lives, in our intimate circles and civically, and in our structures. So the next thing I want to say is that I for as much as I know about personality theory and therapeutic technique, I am not a therapist. For as much as I know about medicine, I'm not a doctor. For as much as I know about the law, I'm not an attorney. For as much as I know about all sorts of other things, I am a rabbi. And in that context, I am a practitioner. So everything that I talk about is from the role of practitioner. I'm not an academic, for as much as I can talk about Jewish theology and all sorts of other theological things, on and on and on. I'm not an academic. I have great love for all of those things, but I come at this issue of mental illness and spirituality exclusively as a practitioner. Somebody who metaphorically and literally sits at the bedside of people who are sick. And I have a very deep, abiding personal fascination and commitment to the spiritual narrative solely. It doesn't mean that I don't hear other narratives, but I am a practitioner of spiritual care at the bedside, and that is what informs everything that I say, even if it dips into the legal, the medical, the civic narrative. And I have a very strong commitment to this spiritual narrative, so as we move along the way, I'm hoping to coax you with it, to push you with it, to advocate with you with it, and to really encourage you with it. So I just want to sort of just continue to funnel down. Usually if you're, I'm just going to say it, a synagogue, but you can think of your coffee hour at your church or other civic engagements that you have, here in this beautiful social hall at the Oneg, at the coffee hour after services on Friday night or Saturday morning, typically we meet somebody that we know and we'd say, how have you been? And the person might say, oh, I've had such a terrible week. I got sick, my husband got sick, we have to go for tests. And typically what we'll do is we'll say, oh, I know the best oncologist. Oh, I know the best surgeon. Oh, I know the best fill in the blank. Now, it's not a bad thing to do. But there we are, often running with the medical narrative. In a house of worship, I want to sort of put a little asterisk there. Or we meet somebody that we've known for a really long time, and we say, oh, Jane, I haven't seen you in so long. I heard that your husband died. How are you doing? And Jane says, because she feels safe, if the bastard wasn't dead, I'd already kill him, because a week before he died, he promised me he'd go to the attorney and take care of the estate plans, and he didn't. And now I'm stuck with probate. Now I'm stuck with off and running, right? And then you say, oh, do you know John Schwartz? He's the best estate attorney in the peninsula. And then we're off and running with the legal narrative, okay? Also not a bad thing to do, okay? Let's take it a little bit more funneled. Oh, I hear that your son just had a very difficult time, and it's only a year after his bar mitzvah. What's happened? You say, oh, you know, my son, we don't really know why, but we've not been very public about it, but he had a psychotic break. And we actually don't know what's going on. And then we say, who's your psychiatrist? Where did he go? If this doesn't help at Stanford, UCSF, wherever, I know this great place in Idaho. It helps so-and-so. Now again, not a bad thing. Not a bad thing. But there we are, often running on, again, the psychiatric narrative. Again, in a house of worship. So what I want to say to you is, the spiritual narrative in a place of worship, and the way in which we use our clergy, because I want to encourage all of you to think differently about how to use your clergy, use us clergy, is for the spiritual narrative. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, but so now I want to ask you a question. So it makes sense so far? as a kind of way to funnel ourselves? Okay. If we think of a person as a whole person, then we want to pay attention to everything about that person, even the things we don't know about them, and that includes the spiritual narrative. What is somebody's spiritual life? What is that? So I want to ask you a question. We're not going to go around the whole room, but I just want to ask you one really simple question for yourself. Take a moment of quiet. What is something for you personally that is spiritual? What is something for you personally that is spiritual? And I want to ask you to just inside yourself, once you kind of have what that is, think about what about it makes it spiritual for you. So what is something that very personally for you is spiritual, and what about it makes it spiritual for you? So let's just take like a moment of quiet and just kind of think about that for yourself quietly. Okay. Just raise your hand if what you thought of has something to do with being in nature. Like the ocean, a hike, something with nature. Okay, raise your hand if whatever you thought of has something to do with the arts, like music, the symphony, opera, jazz. Okay. Okay. Raise your hand if what you thought of has something to do with a sport, like running, swimming, either individually or a team, okay? Raise your hand if what you thought of has something to do with the relationship to a human being or even to an animal, to a pet. Okay? Raise your hand if you thought of something that you might think of as an idea or something that's cognitive, like string theory or the fascination of a mathematical equation. Something cognitive like that, a thought. Okay, great. So, I'm a rabbi. Here we are in a synagogue, right? And look at the degree to which even those of us who are adherents to a particular theology name something that is spiritual for us that isn't necessarily theological. Now, the truth is that every theology infuses all these things into its theology and liturgy. So we have these things in a theological context. But at the root of, I want to assert, our humanity, the way we are created, if we believe we're created in God's image, then we are all endowed with what I think of as a natural spiritual hunger that we seek to satisfy. And I think people will do anything to satisfy their spiritual hunger. So that most people in the world, now again, I'm a practitioner, I'm not an academic, most people in the world have spiritual experience in nature. That is predominant. After that is something about the arts, like the symphony, the orchestra, the opera, Broadway show tunes, jazz. And then from there, levels of relationship and physical activity and sport and just contemplating something, an idea. And we're not going to have the time to do this, but chances are, if we heard just from a few of us, if you talked about what makes that spiritual for you, what makes listening to the opera spiritual for you, what makes taking a hike spiritual for you, what makes walking your dog or playing with your dog spiritual for you, what is it about swimming or a sport that makes it spiritual for you, whatever language you would use yourself, it would come down to, at its core, some language that articulates that it's a state in which you find yourself aware of something that is beyond your own personal physical boundaries. Now you might say God, you might say I'm part of the bigger universe, you might say I'm part of something beyond myself, but whatever that language is, it's a recognition at its core that in that spiritual experience, what makes it spiritual for you is that you feel that you are in a place in which you are fully 100% aware of something beyond your own self. That you are somehow connected beyond, whether you call it God, Jesus, Allah, Buddha, or not. So what I want to say is, at the core of spiritual experience, to satisfy our spiritual hunger, we are endowed in such a way that we chase awe. We have this desire to pursue awe, A-W-E. That state, that place, that experience in which we have a spiritual experience so that we can mine it. By the insights we gain, by the ways in which we feel calmer because it reduces our stress, by the ways in which we are able to feel more caring and more clarity about how to be in the world beyond ourselves, by the ways in which we come to identify the way we'd like to be cared for. Am I making sense so far? Okay. The thing about mental illness, well, let's just say about all illness, typically if somebody's in grief, or certainly at the end of life, classically under hospice care or palliative care, or sick, we naturally move toward how could somebody be nourished spiritually. Now the thing is, already to know this about another person is very intimate. Just in a moment, think about how many people in your life do you know this about or not? To know what somebody is nourished by spiritually is really an intimate piece of knowledge. So that if somebody is dying, and you know that part of their spiritual core is they love the opera, and they love Maria Callas, they love Puccini opera, and that is what nourishes them spiritually, to know that so that on their deathbed, you don't have to worry about whether or not they're getting touch. You don't have to worry about whether or not they've got a room with a view. You don't have to worry about whether the cat or dog therapist is coming in to be with them. All you have to do is download, get a tape recorder, put in earphones or whatever, and push play for Maria Callas. Because that is what is going to nourish them at their last breath. So to know it is really intimate. That's different than knowing the other person is very much attracted to the sea. So maybe they need, on their deathbed, a room with a view. To know that a person craves touch and doesn't care about music and doesn't care about nature, but just needs to have someone hold their hand as they die. So these are just examples about how understanding this spiritual narrative can conjugate into a very concrete way of operationalizing it. And it starts with caring. It starts with knowing that about a person. So the spiritual narrative has a lot to do with intimacy. And intimacy in ways that we may not be used to understanding. So here's something that I've seen over years. You might agree or disagree. The very real problem, part of the terrible stigma, and I have to say, of late, I don't like that word, but I'm not quite sure what word to use, to be honest with you, but I've used that word all the time. I just think stigma may not really be the best word to be using anymore, because in of itself it's stigmatizing, but anyways, be that as it may, maybe we'll come up with a new vocabulary, or you will, that would be a project into 2020. One of the most terrible inherent problems and stigmas about mental illness is that inherently, whether we articulate it or not, we pull the spiritual narrative out of that disease experience. Oh, she's delusional. Oh, it's the schizoid affective disorder. Oh, they need more medication. Oh, maybe you should talk with your psychiatrist about changing your cocktail. Because all of us hear voices. All of us in grief, everybody in grief says, oh, I heard my mother's voice the other morning. Say, I love you. Say, buy that purse. Right? I heard my father say, attaboy. I heard my grandmother, who died when I was 10, say, oh, I'm so proud of you because of the way you helped that elderly person across the street. Right? But if somebody has mental illness, and they talk about regular spiritual narrative experiences that we all have, we don't nourish the spiritual narrative. We devolve to the medical narrative that something is wrong. So it's doubly stigmatizing. So we deny a person with mental illness the wholeness of the ways in which a spiritual narrative can actually be nourishing. And in fact, if we know that somebody, when we're experiencing a mental illness episode, that we love nature or we love the symphony, for someone to say, let's go take a walk in the park. To say, let's cook together. I know you love the smell of chicken soup, whatever it is. We don't typically think of supporting somebody in mental illness by understanding, knowing, supporting, and coaxing and encouraging their spiritual life. And part of what I have seen is that can be the ultimate stigma. To yank that out from somebody, that can put somebody into a spiritual crisis. That can accentuate anxiety. That can push somebody to be not compliant. That can push somebody to forget about doctor's appointments, because it's one of the most ultimately isolating human experiences to have. So a simple way of saying is, if you take Jesus out of somebody's life, if you take God out of somebody's life, if you take Buddha out of somebody's life, if you take Allah out of somebody's life, you can really hurt them. You can really hurt somebody by doing that. But we do it passively, by the way we respond to somebody in a mental state, in a state of stress. So you can imagine, if you're having a common conversation with somebody, you don't have to devolve to like a referral point. You can just meet them where they're at. Oh, you look, I'm just kind of making this up. I can understand how much anxiety you have. What helps you with anxiety? Do you like to listen to music? I noticed during services you have this beautiful voice and you sing so much. Is music something that helps you feel more connected? Oh. Have you listened to, sometimes we just have to be reminded of something we like, right? Oh, I remember X. Oh yeah, I forgot about that. I'm so stressed out. Thanks for reminding me. So the ways in which we can, in a very simple way, move toward this spiritual narrative. But again, we have to know it about somebody. We have to get to know ourselves in that way. We have to care. We have to be cared for. So, makes sense so far? Okay, So I'm going to pass out, in a moment, I'm going to pass out a prayer card that I'm going to ask us just to go over. We're going to do it a couple of different ways. But let me just stop and ask, because I know we're going to do Q&A, but let me just stop and ask so far, any thought, disagreement, reflection, sound obvious what I'm saying? New, different? Any thought? Yeah.
I don't understand.
Carol,
Cheryl.
Cheryl.
I don't understand.
Sorry.
I don't understand if somebody comes up to you and they are, you can tell they're rattled in
Yeah.
any way.
Yeah.
And if they, if you say, well, what's the matter? You look upset. How are you taking away their feeling of God, Allah, Buddha, whatever? I don't understand what you mean by that.
Oh, okay, great question. So I didn't mean to say when somebody comes up and says they're upset, that if you just say how are you feeling, that's taking that away from them. What I'm saying is that if we sort of move them toward understanding, like have you seen your therapist lately, or have you seen your doctor lately, that's not a bad thing to do, but in a faith-based way, if we're concerned about supporting somebody in their religious or their spiritual or their faith-based world and life, that kind of negates it. That doesn't support what their spiritual impulse might be. That's what I'm saying. So it's not taking it away, but there are lots of ways, again, the way I see it, in our culture, that we actually don't pay attention to the spiritual narrative in lots and lots of different ways. Now, it's not to say medical research isn't crucial. It is. It's not to say that political advocacy isn't important in our state legislature. It is. All those things are important, but none of those things are societal structures that help people have a good life, but they don't necessarily cure or help people to live with mental illness. I think the spiritual narrative is what helps us live with a mental, stress, as an example. So that's what I mean. Yes, ma'am.
What I hear you saying is, say, you seem anxious. You're a little bit anxious. And it's where you take that acknowledgement. Do you take it to that, have you seen your therapist, to what's your prayer life like? Is it, or is God saying something to you? Do you feel lonely? It's opening it up to the spiritual narrative rather than directing it to a more problem solving based on.
Yes, thank you. So not moving toward problem solving rather than seeing it as if it's sort of a mental illness equation, 2 + 2 = 4, and how do we find the theorem, which happens, but rather, yes, how do you move into a place of care for that person? And again, it's what I see as the core function of a faith-based structure. Use of clergy, use of your religious life, that sort of a thing.
I don't need to talk out too much.
Let him go for, after. No.
Well, yeah, it
Go ahead
doesn't
and then
matter.
come back to you.
Well, this is just a bit of a more general question, but on a personal level, if you don't know what your spiritual anchor, for lack of a better word, is, how do you find it?
Oh my God, I'm so glad you asked me that.
So part of what I like to sort of advocate for is that we do find those things for ourselves. That's a legitimate exploration as much as discovering what your talent is. Like, oh, you're great with math. We live in structures that are already set up in a very simple way, like, oh, I think that she's like really good at piano rather than guitar. I'm gonna go get piano lessons. Oh, let's discover soccer. Let's discover football. So lots of us don't know that. So part of what I think is important to encourage is, what is it? So not to put you on the spot, but whatever came up for you about what is spiritual for you, whatever that was, might give you an indication of what it was. If I recall correctly, you raised your hand for a sport, right? Okay. So not to hold you to it, because we can change or we can explore it, but I think that faith structures like a synagogue or church are exactly the place where we get to explore that and become more articulate about it. It's a natural laboratory for it. It's a way to understand it. But again, I think it's not as well developed as other parts of our life. But yes, I think it's part of the way we have to sort of commit ourselves to saying, I want to discover that about myself. The way sometimes people who retire say, I've always wanted to take a painting class. And then lo and behold, they discover they're an amazing artist, as an example. So,
So could I just ask a quick
yeah,
follow-up?
go ahead. And,
So you would say, would you say that generally that search is best guided by intuition as opposed to reason? You know, that search.
Oh, that's a really great,
He's a product of this.
so his comment was, I'm going to sort of paraphrase, is sort of spiritual life and a product of intuition rather than reason. So I would say yes and no. So plenty of people have very strong spiritual life cognitively, and so reason in and of itself is actually a spiritually anchoring experience. So if that's the case, then that's the case. For a lot of people it is intuition, for a lot of people it's sort of both and. So again, I would say, it's cultivating that spiritual landscape inside yourself to understand it for yourself and how it functions. Cheryl wanted to make a, go ahead, I told Cheryl I'd come back to her. Yeah.
First of all, I just read this prayer, and it was Rabbi Elliot Kukla that wrote it, and she just performed a ceremony for my mother who passed away in November. She was absolutely wonderful, and prior to that, for my husband was Rabbi Summer.
Oh.
And I just have such
So 2 rabbis from the Bay Area Jewish Healing Center. Thank you for the commercial.
Absolutely lifesavers for me. But so many people that I encounter don't want to be involved in any spiritual feelings. They don't believe in a higher being. And it's not just a few, but there's a lot of people that feel like that. That, there is really no God. Look what's going around, all the fires. People losing their homes, people losing lives. Is there really a God? So it is not. It's just not. I'm very aware of people with this kind of feeling that they are not running to their churches, they're not running to the temples, they're not running to clergy. They just have kind of given it all up. And my father was like that. At the end of his life, I said, "Do you want a rabbi?" No. Even though they were involved with Temple Manual in the city, nope, didn't want it. My mother was kind of the same way.
David, really can't. We can't.
I'm going to paraphrase Cheryl. Basically, she was complimenting the healing center, but thank you. So basically, she was saying that there are a lot of people who reject religion, don't want to be a part of it, look at the world like the fires and say, really, there isn't a God, etc. So, yes. And what I would just like to suggest, just again as a practitioner, is there's a very strong distinction between theology and religion and God issues, and even rabbis and priests and ministers, and imams, and people's spiritual impulse. So I could be wrong, but I just assert, and it's not to agree with me or disagree with me, but just to say truth in advertising for me, that a spiritual impulse is way more human and pervasive beyond any formal theological religious structure. And we live in a part of the country, a part of the state, where the affiliation with a synagogue, a church, a mosque, a place of worship is actually minimal. Partly for lots and lots of reasons, but I think partly because of that way in which people feel connected or not connected to formal structures, for lots and lots of reasons. But I mean, that we can all spend like days on exploring, but that's just part of it. But I think the distinction is that we have a spiritual impulse that's different from a theological impulse, which is why I asked, what do people have a spiritual experience? Nature, arts, etc. You notice I did not ask anything about being in a liturgical, prayerful framework, even though I'm a rabbi, so I obviously have my opinion, but yeah, so that's what I would say. So it's not that I'm trying to convince anybody otherwise. I know both exist, but that's how I come to it, out of my work with people in the vulnerability of being sick and dying and in grief. So, Ma'am.
Yeah, hi, my name is Dana, and I just wanted to say you were talking about how even in a place of worship here at the temple, that if you run into someone and you start a conversation, you say, how are you? And they say, okay, but I got sick, and you refer for medical narrative. And I was going to say that yourselves here at the temple put on a presentation on suicide prevention and postvention. Remember at the California Clubhouse? Maybe you may not remember. And Nargis Dillon was talking about suicide. And one of the things I learned through the suicide training and what I learned from Nargis was that you get the story first. And we have to learn to be good listeners. So we're
Great,
not
yes.
sending them on to, okay, this doctor's about to go to that doctor. You have to listen and really care about the person enough to receive what they're saying. And like I said, with these suicide trainings, that's what they say. Before you give advice, before you refer on, before you have them call an actual suicide line yourselves, you have to get the true story. And the second thing I wanted to present and just make people aware is I am living with a mental illness. And one of my experiences being, I actually came home here to Stanford, and one of the doctors actually gave me medication that made me see my life flash before me. So I kind of had a gut, you would say. So I thought that might be interesting for those people who do not have mental illness and cannot relate. And so, and also there is in the mental health community, there is definitely a sense of good and bad. So I also thought I was a very bad person. And I'm fascinated by the paranormal. And I've read a book by Randy Moody, and he mentioned that people with mental illness don't cross over very well. They don't cross over into heaven very well. So I just wanted to give that perspective. Encourage, and please encourage people with mental illness to speak about their spirituality and to figure it out.
Yes,
open
thank
it
you.
and figure it out.
I gave away my last, can I take this?
I just want to say one of the interpretations I have.
Do you have an extra one?
Particularly for those who aren't accepting of clergy during a time of crisis or near death, is that act of just caring is that form of spirituality. Taking the time to touch where that person's at.
So let's say last comment for the time being, then I want to just sort of move to this prayer as a little concrete example of a few things. Go ahead.
My name is Chip Lundell, and I like the distinction of asking someone where their spirituality is to understand where they're at peace, what that spiritual exercise is for them. The difficulty is going from the question of how are you, and without knowing where someone's spiritual exercise is, or the intimacy of where they are spiritually. And I think there's a big gap between, for example, if I know what my wife's spirituality is, I know that in times of stress, I can go to that place with her. That's walking on the beach, or that's reading a book, or suggest that. But when I don't know someone, then I have a vast gap of knowledge about where they are. But I think, kind of answer the question over here a little bit, I think it has something to do with listening and caring first. My question is, were you starting with sort of the end point as a means to get there when you said, when you asked us where our spirituality is? Because I don't think necessarily that we all have that understanding when we're addressing people in our close community. Enough knowledge to kind of bring them there.
Oh my gosh, so I don't even know you're right. I didn't ask you to plant that question. But it sort of moves sort of a little bit of a segue to this as well. So this sort of is in the category of sort of what I have seen how we clergy, we faith folks function, and how people with mental illness sort of, I interact with them as an example. Everybody who comes to the healing center chooses to. We don't ambulance chase, people come to us, so you can say it's sort of like a selected group already, right? So out of all of that, as a practitioner, I think that we're in a very important transition that sort of goes to your question. In just regular human experience, and if I can just say, without embarrassing Rabbi Feeder and David Korth, as a lay leader, that I think PTS is an example of an organization that's moving in this trajectory, okay? For a very long time, faith-based structures were the safest place for an adherent of that particular faith, like in the Catholic community, in the Jewish community, in the Buddhist community. They were safe structures for adherents to come together with like-minded people, like culturally safe, to listen to civic information and trust it. So that if you listen to a psychiatrist tell you the latest of adolescent research in your synagogue, in your church, as an example, then just because it was in that place, you trusted the information. But still, it's medical information. If you had an attorney come to your church, to your synagogue, to talk about what is estate planning, for setting up a special needs trust, for your son who has schizoaffective disorder and cannot even manage his own finances, that you as a parent of course want to make sure is secure after you die. And then if that conversation, fully the legal narrative, happens inside your church, your synagogue social hall, after church, after Bible study, then you trust the information. Now again, those are not bad things. But I think where we're at now is that we bring the spiritual narrative conversation in the place where it belongs. Because if you don't have a spiritual narrative conversation with your clergy person, or inside your faith-based structure, you don't have it anywhere. By the flip of it, the only place where it belongs is here. And if we neglect that, then we do a certain kind of disservice on lots and lots of levels. So to your point, it takes a commitment to say, I want to know you spiritually. I want to know that intimately about you. And where else for that to happen but your church, your synagogue, your mosque, your place of worship? It will not happen with, your best friend sitting in the doctor's office. It won't happen with your doctor. It won't happen with maybe it will happen with your therapist, depends. But that's exactly, I think, where we're at. So that's kind of like my coax, is that we've moved structurally from synagogues, I can say this as a rabbi, that has a lecture series on whatever you want to call it, social action around advocating for prison reform, around issues that have to do with sentencing when someone has a mental illness. Very good. But that lecture can happen at, a civic organization down the street, at the Chamber of Commerce. Now, you may not trust that conversation if it's not inside your faith community, but that's the transition I think we're under. Just to go to your point. Does that make sense? So we're not there yet. That's something I would like to sort of encourage people to think about. How do you transform your faith-based community into a place of spiritual narrative intimacy, where you know that? How do you use your clergy for that conversation, rather than saying to your clergy person, oh, I'm really upset, I need to find the best doctor. So that's not a bad use of your clergy person. But I want to encourage you to sort of think of your clergy person as the person you can go talk to about your spiritual experience and the paranormal, or I'm just kind of like using you as an example because you brought it up, but like, I took this medication and I think I had a very important conversation with God, and I'd like to talk with you about that. Where else are you going to do that? So it takes sort of risks and leaps of faith on all sorts of levels. So that's where I think we're at. Okay. I lost track of time.
We have about 25 minutes before a Q&A.
Oh, okay. So I'm going to go to this prayer for mental illness that Rabbi Krupler wrote. He wrote this in 2008. Part of our commitment at the Healing Center, we provide Jewish spiritual care for folks who are ill, dying, and bereaved. And in that context, we just have a very strong commitment to issues of mental illness as well in the Jewish community. So there are lots of ways to use a prayer, and depending on your faith and community, there's lots of assumptions about what prayer is. So what I want to do is just to, in a very conscientious way, just take this from the perspective of dissecting it. Now, you can use prayer in lots of ways. It can be used privately. It can be used liturgically from the pulpit. It can be used to build community. There's lots and lots of ways in which a church, a synagogue, a mosque, a Buddhist temple uses its liturgy, traditionally and creatively. That's not what we're going to do now, okay? So what I want to do is take us through this prayer and kind of dissect it. And dissect it from the perspective of encouraging an understanding of the spiritual narrative. So it begins with a prayer of healing for mental illness. So not of mental illness, but for, to support the mental illness experience. Okay? So, may the one who blessed our ancestors bless all those who live with. Okay, so what do you just notice? Just the way, how do you respond to just those words? May the one who blessed our ancestors bless all those. So just like what comes to mind just with those words?
God.
God comes to mind, okay, even though the word God isn't in there, but okay, yeah.
Go ahead.
Mental illness is not a new thing. Yeah. Okay, what else?
We're making implicitly a spiritual connection between the one who has mental illness with our matriarchs and patriarchs. They are not removed from the ancestors of our tradition. They are a direct lineage too.
Yes. So yeah, go ahead.
Gender neutral language, which I don't know if it was intended, it was written 11 years ago, but as somebody who spends a lot of time with prayer, the fact that it uses gender neutral language leads me to believe that whoever wrote it is very neutral and compelled to kind of dig deeper than what's on the surface.
Great, thank you. So just those comments into structure. So Rabbi Kukla himself is transgender, so the gender piece of it is deliberate. So yes, there's a deliberate declaration of transcendence. May the one. And there's a deliberate lack of using the word God. Because we live in a part of the country, certainly a part of the state, where just if that word God was the first word, then like somebody would say, oh, thanks. No thanks, right? So may the one, and that there's a deliberate link historically across the millennia. That mental illness might be a new word that we have in the United States, our English lexicon, but mental illness in this case is deliberately linked to our ancestors. And you'll see later on our matriarchs and patriarchs. Why? To sort of say you have a place. And not only do you have a place, you have an historic sanction. It's not abnormal. It isn't. It's regular. And if something is regular, on a certain level, it's expected. And if something's expected, we may not all experience something that's expected, but whatever it is that we experience is not unusual, it's not on the margins. So it's a deliberate attempt to immediately embrace and to not stigmatize, okay? So live with mental illness, their caregivers, families, and friends. So again, the inclusivity of all of it. So immediately, it's putting the experience into a community of care, an historic community of care. So I just want to have, like, by just a raise of hands, whoever sort of automatically thought that their faith tradition would understand that mental illness is actually sanctioned within the context of its biblical historic figures. Some of us yes, some of us no. Okay. So then, does someone want to sort of just read the next sentence? Just someone out there, just yell it out. Start with may they.
May they walk in the footsteps of Jacob, King Saul, Mary, Hannah, and Naomi, who struggled with dark moods, hopelessness, isolation, and terrors, but survived and led our people.
So what, anything strike you there? Yes, hopelessness, isolation, terrors are not the entirety of a person. Coexist with great success, leadership, and other accomplishments. Yeah. Yes, ma'am. What can be cyclical? I just didn't hear the word you used.
That those can be ephemeral, they can be also chronic, but people can experience them and then they can go away too.
Great. Anything else?
Just so it comes from the strength. There's strength in the midst of all of the dimensions. There's strength because they led the people. They became believers.
Yes. Yes, they led our people. They led our people. So I want to say what might seem like obvious, but just to say it out loud. It doesn't say who struggled with schizophrenia, who lives with clinical depression, who had postpartum depression, on and on and on. So there's a deliberate way in which the language that's used is not medical or legal narrative language. It's kind of a generic language because even if you don't have a diagnosed mental illness, there's not a one of us in this room who doesn't know terror. There's not a one of us who doesn't know isolation, hopelessness, a dark mood, whatever we want to call a dark mood. So it's all of us in different ways, but survived and led our people. So already it's a paradigm of leadership. Now, especially in the United States, we don't typically like to think of leadership characteristics as these things. We like to think of other words for leadership characteristics. And even civically, if you go to leadership development organizational structures, I've been through some of them myself. There's not one session that talks about, let's talk about hopelessness as the leadership characteristic for you to lead your people. Not one. But if we don't dive into that landscape and develop that with our religious identity development, then who's going to? And I don't want to be too political, but I think we live in an era where we are coming to understand the power of vulnerability is quite important for the health of our country and how we care. So, I'm just going to read this. Just as our father Jacob spent the night wrestling with an angel and prevailed. So do you know what story now? Don't be embarrassed if you don't know. Do you know what deliberate story that's referring to? Jacob, our father, spent the night wrestling with an angel and prevailed. Do you know what story that is? Yeah. So what's the story?
Well, it's the story of, it's the story of when he laid down his head, and sometimes known as Jacob's ladder.
Yes.
That where, he struggled, he woke up, he wouldn't let
So Jacob, our patriarch, has a dream. He's fighting with an angel. He has this transcendent experience. It's very explicit. It's apparent, what we might say paranormal. The end of which is his name is changed from Jacob to Israel, Yisrael, one who wrestles. So that it's sanctioning this whole experience as being transformative. So for a lot of us, a common experience with mental illness is that we feel changed or transformed. And there's a lot in our culture that tells us to get back to the way we used to be. And that in and of itself can be stigmatizing. But rather, this is a liturgical way, in a modern way, it's written by Rabbi Kukla, to sort of say the experience of mental illness is akin to being transformed and wrestling. And you are by design not the same. You're not the same. Okay. Spent the night wrestling with an angel and prevailed. May all those who live with mental illness be granted the endurance to wrestle with their pain and prevail night upon night. Grace them with the faith to know that though, like Jacob, they may be wounded, shaped, and renamed by the struggle, they still will live on to continue an ever-unfolding, unpredictable path toward healing. So one of the things I just want to say that is, I think, important for that is that part of understanding the spiritual narrative is to know where you take a leap of faith and not knowing where you're going to land. I think that one of the things that happens in mental illness in the most acute way is that you do not know what will come next. And that is a core spiritual experience. So I'm going to digress before we come to the very end of this prayer and sort of talk a little bit more about it. I'm going to digress a little bit on the spirit to just make a point about the spiritual narrative. You all know the story of the Exodus. So you all know that it's the story of the children of Israel are slaves in Egypt. Moses says, "Let my people go." The children of Israel follow Moses out of Egypt after all the plagues, come to the Red Sea parts, wander in the desert, manna from heaven, covenant at Sinai, 10 Commandments, right? And in the Jewish tradition, we tell that whole story at Passover. And in the Christian community, it's a core Bible story. In the Muslim community, it's a core Bible story. And every faith tradition uses that story, among other stories, as a way to understand modern day life. How are we enslaved today? What's a plague? How do we wander today? What's getting manna from heaven? What's covenanting? What are modern 10-day commandments? How are the 10 Commandments still relevant today, right? Every clergy person is given a sermon on that. So we all use that Bible story to sow its elements into religious identity. Fair enough? Okay. So this is what I want to say to you on the issue of mental illness in particular. If you really do retroject yourself back into history and pretend that you are a child of Israel in that contemporary time, which every faith tradition asks us to do in that Bible story, in whatever way it does. If you retroject yourself, and in this moment you imagine you're a child of Israel then, let's say in the midst of like the 5th plague, the truth is this: you do not know the end of your own story. That is the ultimate spiritual truth. Nobody but nobody knows the end of their own story. So everybody takes a leap of faith with the next step. And the thing is this: we know the story and we use it to sow a religious identity into ourselves as a Jew, as a Muslim, as a Christian. by what we know about that story, but we know the story. A child of Israel in its own time doesn't know the end of their own story. So maybe all you did was say yes to Moses because you liked him. Maybe you said yes to Moses because your neighbor was going. I'm going to join that church because my next door neighbor goes to that church. I'm going to go to that synagogue because my friend, goes to that synagogue. You just went because another person was going. Or you went because you just had this idea that the next step forward would be better than the step before. You just took a leap of faith and you went. One of the most potent experiences of mental illness that I think gets short shrift, that we don't pay attention to as part of the core spiritual narrative, is for a lot of people, and I'm not being Pollyannish about it, so I'm just kind of making a point, but I know it's a true point, but not true for everybody. A core experience of mental illness is that, for example, depression can be among the most spiritually potent experiences for anybody in their life, because you decide to take a leap of faith. I'll open my eyes this morning. I'll swing myself off the bed and let my feet dangle. I'll put my feet into my slippers. I'll take a step. I'll go forward. That is living the core spiritual truth. Nobody knows the end of their own story. And every step you take is a leap of faith, no matter who you are. So that's an example where, on the theological level, we can be told the story in a way that denies a certain spiritual experience, because we know the story. We're interested in sewing that story into the ways in which we take on social action projects. All good. But the core spiritual narrative for some of us with mental illness is to understand those stories as part of the way in which our ancestors are teaching us what does it mean to live the spiritual landscape in the midst of mental illness, like what we call depression. So, in a world where spirituality is defined by the search for meaning and purpose, what I want to suggest to you is the experience of mental illness in the spiritual narrative is that kind of isn't true. Spiritual life is defined by taking leaps of faith and not knowing the meaning or the purpose of something. We may arrive to points and way stations of meaning and purpose, but they are the result of taking a leap of faith, and it's not the only result. There are 1,000,001 people in the world who will die without feeling like they've gained pure meaning and purpose because they are so curious about the world. They have tried so much, they've taken so many leaps of faith and learned so much and cultivated that part of their spiritual landscape, they never arrive to a place of 100% total meaning and purpose because they're interested in so many things and their curiosity is so vast. There are others of us who have. But meaning and purpose is not the purpose or result of a spiritual life. Cultivating the capacity to take a leap of faith and understanding how to live not knowing the end of your own story is the core of spiritual landscape. And that's the core of a spiritual narrative that I think only clergy and our willingness to use our clergy in this way and explore this and a faith structure can meet. Those things will not be cultivated in the legal narrative, in the medical narrative, in the psychosocial narrative. They only are cultivated in the spiritual narrative. So that this kind of a prayer embodies all those things, and you can use this as a way to get into the language of it, get into the dialogue of it, but you can also use it from the pulpit and just declare it liturgically. So this is just one example of ways in which I would like to sort of encourage you and to coax you to really think about what this spiritual narrative really is and how you can cultivate it into your community so that it goes beyond it goes into things that you might want to think of about for yourself and your community. So, as an example, we can brainstorm ad infinitum about this. If your church community has a number of people who get overstimulated during coffee hour because of the noise, the acoustics aren't so great, then maybe a way to support somebody in that more vulnerable state because they've just come out of the psychiatric unit or because they're experimenting with new medications is to have a quiet table for your coffee hour. Not because people have mental illness and because you want to sort of sequester people, but to say we're going to be inclusive of all the different ways that we care about each other and pay attention to these things. So that kind of a thing. Everybody can brainstorm all these different things in their own particular faith community because of every community is different. But I'm going to close just by saying I hope that what I have sort of convinced you of is to really think deeply about the spiritual narrative, not to the exclusion of the others, but to its complete, solid, committed inclusion. That there is only one place where the spiritual narrative can conscientiously be cultivated, and that is in a faith community. Among ourselves in this context. And it isn't to negate any of the other narratives, but it's to understand that that's our role, and if we don't do it, nobody else will. And if nobody else will, then we inherently neglect one of the only reasons why we exist, which is to cultivate the spiritual, religious, and theological. There is no other justification for the existence of a church, a synagogue, a mosque, etc., but that. So that especially in the United States, where we have this sort of beautiful value of civic engagement, if we don't fulfill our core purpose, then we lose our capacity to care. And if we lose our capacity to care, then we actually neglect inherently our spiritual wholeness. And that's the ultimate stigmatization. So with that, I hope I stimulated you enough to think about what you might want to do into the future, and really thank you for your time and attention, and we can do Q&A.
Cards at one over here. Now, if that's the only card, it's going to be hard to keep it anonymous. So please, are there any other questions? Comments, thoughts? Okay, we do have some, more than one. Shuffling up now. And if something occurs to you as we're doing this, please go ahead, write it down, and just raise your hand. Someone will come get it from you. How do we tailor our intervention attempts, particularly to teens and young adults who need help with mental challenges, given their spirituality may be less well-formed than adults?
Oh, that's a great question. So, are there teen educators in the room? Anybody here? Are there teen educators in the room? People with teens in their life? Yeah. So I've done a teeny bit. Rabbi Gelson has a confirmation class that works on different topics. So, similar to all of us, we like to feel like we belong in the world. And all of us know that one of the core teen needs is to belong. And peer pressure is a really beautiful entry point with teens. So one of the things that I would just suggest and discover, and maybe the teen educators can sort of bring this up, is that every teen, like a lot of us, forgets that our insides are different than our outsides. And that we struggle with how do we reveal our insides to the outside. And the teen years are core years for all of us on that very simple way of being in the world. So I've discovered that when working with teens, a little differently than working with adults, that affirming peer pressure in a good way, peer support, ways of being with one another, and I think that's where you can cultivate caring in a lot of different ways, becomes crucial for teens around the issue of mental illness. Because all of us when we're teens think, oh, I feel X, I'm the only one in the world. I feel Y, I'm the only one in the world. I will tell you in a more personal level, and it won't surprise you because we all know this is in the world, but I'm going to speak more personally as an openly gay rabbi. Even today, if you are a gay or lesbian or transgender teen, it doesn't matter what you see in the world or any other examples, you still feel like you're the only one with that experience. If you have a family where your mother or father is having difficulty in their marriage and even on the verge of divorce, you know that people divorce, but you feel like you're the only one. Teen years are filled with experiences that are isolating. They're isolating because we feel like we can't say what's happening. We feel like we don't know how to understand what's going on inside ourselves. So, I don't know, maybe I'm not to put you on the spot, but if you want to add anything, what's crucial about mental illness issues with teens is that it's done in a group with peers and it's done in a way where it's not isolating. So I don't know if you would add to that or not. Yeah.
Me?
Yeah. Because you said you were a teen educator.
Sort of.
Yeah.
I spend a lot of time with 12 and 13-year-olds, so preteen, barely teen. And what I will add actually is that in the realm of spirituality, I struggle a lot with helping them connect directly to the prayers and Torah that they're learning if it's not innately there, because this whole concept of God, and there is, I think, a stigma, for lack of a better word, in the public schools, in the greater sphere, especially here where protected history is so robust about believing in God, and well, I think I might believe in God, but my classmate said this, and how am I going to do this prayer from Yima if I sort of believe in God, but this person said that, and am I supposed to think and believe in this?
So you went in a direction I wasn't thinking of, but I'm glad you did. So what I want to say, sort of apropos of some of our conversation, one of the reasons why religiously based youth camps are so successful is because of the music, and because of the nature, and because of the relationality. So that is the cultivation of the spiritual life. That the way you pray is in the context of a song that you love to sing almost becomes incidental. Because it's the music, it's being outside in the campfire, it's playing in that spiritual landscape. So that's what I think is more I would say, even more important to cultivate. And then people can think about the ways in which they look up at a tree and are in awe of the tree, and when they might call it God or Jesus or Allah, or they might think about creation. But I think that's a perfect example where I just think from my perspective with this issue, the theology is not the entry point. The spiritual experience is the entry point, I would say.
So I don't think you know this, but she's our cantor, and so...
I'm sure there are people who are in this state by your voice.
So as
I'm sure
you're speaking to the choir, as it were.
Yeah.
Next question: are you saying that the spiritual narrative is all one needs to navigate through mental illness, not medical narrative as well?
No, I'm not. But again, I'm saying, if we exclude it, then we're neglecting the wholeness of a person.
What I took away from your comments were it's the narrative, it's the spiritual narrative that is missing, that these other things are the natural go that needs cultivating spiritually.
Yes, thank you.
What do you do when a wife or husband is in denial of mental illness? And I don't know if that means their own or somebody else's. Is it spiritual if I want to remove myself from the relationship because it has become very overwhelming?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I don't mean to be so simplistic to such a very serious, complex comment, but all of us need to make decisions about where we feel that we are held and cared for, and where we're safe, if you use that word. So it can be quite a spiritual declaration to say, I'm going to put myself into a place where I feel that that's safer and more cultivated than other places. Not that this isn't a session about domestic violence as an example, but certainly you might love somebody and be in domestic violence. That love doesn't override staying. It could be the most important spiritual act to get out. So, yes, I think that certainly that's true for mental illness.
Thank you. By the way, I want to just take this moment. You all don't yet know all these questions, but these are like such deep, important, great questions, and I just want to thank you for the courage of offering them. If I could read, you can understand the question. How do you suggest staying connected to your spiritual center when you are dealing with the extreme uncertainty of dealing with a mental illness? Well, not mental relative. Mentally ill relative. Want me to reread that?
Yes.
Yeah,
How do you suggest staying connected to your spiritual center when you are dealing with the extreme uncertainty of dealing with a mentally ill relative?
gosh, so again, a complex issue, but what I want to suggest is that, like everything else, it's important for us to cultivate our spiritual lives. So if, again, just kind of being reductionist about it, if you know that you're the kind of person that feels spiritually connected by taking a walk on the beach, then that is a way you stay spiritually connected no matter what. Something that I think doesn't get talked about enough and that lots of people don't want to hear is that cultivating your spiritual life takes discipline. It isn't just when you kind of feel like you're in the mood to find your favorite classic music station, and then you feel stressed out and you realize, oh, I haven't listened to like Mahler's Fifth in 3 months. No wonder I'm stressed out. I gotta go find it. I mean, we do those things, right? Cultivating your spiritual life takes a discipline. And it means that you may or may not feel the same depth of spiritual connection every day when you get up to, for example, if you do this, meditate every morning when you get up. But you do it. You do it for what the momentum is over time. You do it for what it cultivates over time. And that's the way in which you come to understand what that landscape is for you. Broad, deep, shallow, very insightful. But I think that's part of the reality that we don't really always want to acknowledge, which is that caring takes discipline. Caring takes commitment. And if you want to cultivate your spiritual life, there's a point at which that in and of itself takes discipline.
Thank you. So the questions keep coming. We have about 15 minutes, so we'll try to calibrate ourselves. And if we need to go a little over and people are comfortable with that, you have the time to go a little bit over. Could you speak about how you work with empathy in your efforts?
Sure. Thank you. Empathy. Well, empathy, I think, is just sort of like the natural step toward caring. You know, caring in and of itself is an act of empathy. I'm not sure if the person who wrote this is sort of wants to go in this kind of a direction, but where I go with it is that if you sort of just rewind a little bit, sort of we have a natural hunger, spiritual hunger that we want to satisfy, and that this notion of caring in and of itself is the act of yourself toward an other. That is, in a very concrete way, the first act of transcendence. Because if you move from yourself toward an other outside of yourself, then that is a way that you connect to sort of what is beyond yourself as an individual. So psychology likes to call that empathy, like you identify with another person, you see they're a fellow human being, you feel sad, you understand another person can feel sad, you feel happy, you can understand another person feels happy, then we come to understand what makes that person feel sad. Oh, what makes that person feel happy? Oh, what makes that person feel happy is different than what makes me feel happy. On and on and on and on. We can conjugate that out. So I think of, in the context of the spiritual landscape, that acts of empathy are really forms of caring by which we come to understand that there is something at work in the world beyond who I am as an individual person. That's part of what transcendence is. There's something other than me at work in the world. Not only is there something more than me at work in the world, there's something more than the way I experience the world at work in the world. So we can talk about dark moods and hopelessness and isolation and being connected to ancestors. But the way I experience terror is not the same as the other person experiences terror. Oh, you're afraid of the roller coaster? I love the roller coaster. Oh, going to the zoo and seeing a lion roar frightens you? Oh, I find it so fascinating. I think the role of empathy is part of cultivating spiritual life in that sense. I'm not sure if that's what the person was meaning, but that's sort of the way I answered it.
Thank you. Do you mean to say also that those of no organizational faith who are struggling could be asked what would help them spiritually?
Yes. I think part of, if I kind of flip it, from what I've seen, part of people's struggle around issues of mental illness or grief or other illnesses is that they don't feel that their spiritual life that they are attracted to is in fact cultivated in other more traditional religious or theological venues. And that in and of itself is a very strong frustration. I just wish that my church, my synagogue, my mosque would be that way for me. Because people do have it. If only I could feel this way, the way I feel going to the symphony. If only I could feel in church the way I feel running with my runner's group. So yes, I think that that's part of the spiritual theological struggle that we all work with.
Thank you. How can you support someone with mental illness who has questions and feelings relative to God, who also feel that they don't deserve being mentally ill?
That they don't deserve being mentally ill. Is that a version of why me? Maybe?
That's how I would interpret it.
You know, again, these questions are so beautiful and complex, and I want to say, just to say, that in this world of understanding stigma and inclusion, I'm going to come back to your question, but your question is stimulating this other piece of it. Wouldn't it be astonishing to end up in a place where we didn't and I'm not being critical, I'm being more observational with what I'm about to say, we would be in a place where we actually didn't have to think of protective structures like anonymous index cards, right? So there's a lot in that question about how do we respond to somebody who feels that they don't deserve to have mental illness. So it's such a complex spiritual, theological, religious comment, but here's the thing, I will just say for myself, nobody deserves to be sick. In a way, nobody deserves to be happy. Everybody deserves to be seen for the unique creation they are. And again, if that's not the fundamental affirmation of a faith community, then where is it a fundamental affirmation of any society? We have a version of it, all men are created equal, with inalienable rights, on and on and on and on. So, for myself, I'm a man of faith, I do believe in God, and I do believe that every single person is created uniquely in God's image, and in the Jewish framework, B'Tselem Elohim. So, for me, it therefore must be that if we just look around this room and look at our diversity, it must be that our diversity is a testament to God's unfathomable creativity. So everybody deserves to be seen for the God-created uniqueness they are. Everybody deserves to be cultivated in their life for whatever that means. Everybody has the right in the spiritual landscape to be cared for in their faith community in that way. Everybody has the right in that spiritual landscape to care for others, to be given the chance to care for others. So I think as a result of all of those things that are cultivated, people come to feel happy and heard and satisfied and understood. Is that a guarantee against getting a cold? No. Is that a guarantee against getting the flu? No. Is that a guarantee against being hit by a car, by a drunk driver, coming to church, synagogue, whatever? Of course not. So none of us deserve those things. But again, it might come to sort of where you are theologically or spiritually, whether you think those things are random or not, the hand of God or not. But so none of us deserves mental illness any more than any of us deserve breast cancer or a migraine. But we all deserve whatever the best of life can offer because of who we are. So all of us deserve to be cultivated in that way. So.
Thank you very much. What if a spiritual belief, such as Scientology, against psychiatrists and psychologists, get in the way of treatment and recovery?
Oh gosh, so I'm maybe way too naive about that specificity. For me, it's just always important that we support discovery. So, for me, again, it's part of the spiritual landscape. So I have a little bit of a background actually in biology and science. So here's the thing. I think in the laboratory, under the microscope, a scientist is at the crux of awe, AWE. Because you don't know what this thing that's called a proton is going to do. You don't know how this thing that's an electron is going to connect to this thing called a proton and form a bond. And that bond forms a substance that actually interrupts the way in which pain is felt in your nervous system. And lo and behold, you have an aspirin and your headache goes away. So you can kind of conjugate that out to like the discovery of the polio vaccine. Half of us have gone to some place and had the flu shot, right? Okay. We hope it works, but somebody decided these 4 strains are kind of likely going to travel from Asia to North America. Maybe yes, maybe no. Getting the flu shot may or may not guarantee you don't get the flu. But it is a point of discovery. It is a leap of faith. So what I think is important is that we support scientific discovery as a matter of spiritual life. So maybe that's different than just finding out what the latest medications are, but rather coming to understand why this medication, why that medication. Because I think anybody in the laboratory, especially when it comes to psychiatric medications, will tell you how far we have to go to understand it all. Because the brain is so mysterious.
I'd like to throw maybe I'm off on this, but a broader interpretation of the question that's asked. And that is, what happens in whatever religion where doctrine of that religion seems to be counter to treatment or some of the things you're talking about?
Oh, I don't. What would be an example? What would be an example of that?
Well,
I guess I'm thinking that's in a North American modernist framework. But I mean, what? Yeah.
All right. So this example was a Christian Scientist. The doctrine is about intervention of medicine, but it could be certain variations. God, I barely know what I'm talking about now, but stabbing at Christianity or certain. Let me take that up. Certain versions or interpretations of the Bible paint mental illness as sinful. Or, and I made that up, I don't know if that's true, but if there are certain doctrines that seem to be counter to what your messaging is around supporting those with mental illness, what does one do with that?
Oh, so I think, we all know in our own lives, or in our own faith tradition lives, that there are parts of our history that we, are probably more embarrassed about than supportive of, because at one point, racism was justified biblically. Being gay or lesbian was justified biblically. The subjugation of women was justified religiously. And at the same time, we see, for example, women clergy now, in most places, not in all. I'm just saying this because I just read the article the other day. The Catholic Church, Pope Francis is in the midst of a conversation about formally understanding celibacy and married priests or not. So I think the hope is that, at the core of all theology, we understand what moving into the world is all about, and taking a leap of faith and changing theological doctrines to be more spiritually aligned. So every theology struggles with that in different ways. That's the good fight. I think that's a place. That's a good political fight in the context of the faith community. What does it mean to affirm our total equality, women clergy as an example, regardless of race, on and on and on and on. So, does that make sense?
Yes.
I'm answering.
So here's what I'm going to suggest we do. There are 4 questions here, and I'm going to suggest we honor the 5 o'clock mark, that we bring this to a close. And if you wrote a question, whether it's one of these 4 or you have a question that you did not ask, Rabbi, are you willing to stay a little bit?
Yeah.
And then maybe you could just come up individually and speak a bit with the Rabbi, and that way we're honoring the commitment here of his.
And can I close out with these 2? Sure.
Please,
Or do you want
and
to-
then, well, if you could say what you're going to say about this, and then I'm going to ask Rabbi Peter to come up
Yes.
and help us bring it to a close.
So one of the things that I'm just going to, it's up here that you're welcome to take, is that at the Healing Center we created a brochure that is specifically written to, in a caring community context, to encourage congregants to care for fellow congregants who live with mental illness. So this is written from a certain kind of Jewish perspective, but you're welcome to have it as you wish. It is not a panacea, it's not an end-all be-all, but it has some, I think, important pieces that are sort of components of what I've been talking about for you to sort of consider. For your consideration is, you're welcome to have it as you wish, and if you need more, you can contact the Healing Center. And the other thing is that, and we have more of these if anybody would like more. We also have more of these prayer cards if you'd like more. I also brought a number of books that's called, this is again from a Reformed Jewish perspective of where healing resides, Truth in Advertising. I am the architect, narrative writer, author, and writer of some of these specific pieces, Truth in Advertising. And so I brought a few to just give to you. Beyond what I have here, you'll have to go on Amazon or call the publisher and buy them. I nor the Healing Center reap any financial benefit from the sale of this book. But this is specifically written from a Jewish perspective to be a spiritual care bedside reader for the experience of illness and other sort of life-challenging events. The prayer of mental illness is in here, but there are all sorts of prayers and reflections in here that are intended to be more integrative for whatever we think of as the experience of mental illness, like isolation, hopelessness, sadness, etc., that can pervade life, not just because one has a diagnosed mental illness. So that's our effort to kind of mainstream what sometimes gets sequestered as only mental illness. So all these 3 things are available for you to have as you wish.
Thank you very much. With that, I'd like to, first of all, again, acknowledge and we'd like to hand it back to Rabbi Peter to help bring us to a close.
First of all, thank you, David and Rabbi Weiss. Thank you so much. The initiative at this congregation is really a partnership of the lay leadership and the clergy leadership, and it produces things like this today. And thank you all for being here for this. I'd like to close with a prayer, and we all have a version of that prayer in front of us, either on a prayer card or in the book that Rabbi Weiss was just talking about. And I'll draw our attention to...
They don't have the book.
Gotcha, but all of you have the cards, right? Let me draw your attention to the phrase in the second to last line. It's a Hebrew phrase, Sukkot Shalom, and it literally means a canopy of peace. And if you look at the glass etchings on either side, you see a symbol of that Sukkot Shalom, or canopy of peace. You see the talit. And that symbol is a prominent metaphor in our social hall as well as our sanctuary just across this brown divider. And the idea is that all of us who are under that canopy of peace are under the sort of supercharged presence of the Shekhinah, of the presence of God. So, a prayer of healing for mental illness. Let's join together. May the one who blessed our ancestors bless you with strength and healing as I struggle with emotional distress and mental suffering. May I walk in the footsteps of Jacob, King Saul, Miriam, Hannah, and Naomi, who lived with dark moods, hopelessness, isolation, and terror, but survived and led our people. Just as our father Jacob spent the night wrestling with an angel and prevailed, may I be granted the endurance to wrestle with pain and prevail, night upon night. Grant me the faith to know that though, like Jacob, I may be wounded, shaped, and renamed by this struggle, still I will live on to continue an ever-unfolding, unpredictable path toward healing. May I not be alone on this path, but accompanied by family in all its forms, friends, caregivers, ancestors, and the divine presence. Surround me with loving kindness, grace, and companionship, and spread over me a Sukkot Shalom, a shelter of peace and wholeness. And let us say together,
Amen.
Thank
Thank
all
you,
for being
everybody, for being here.